A woman hires a nurse to care for her daughter in the hospital. One day she arrives unexpectedly and is shocked by what she sees. Grace held the fragile hand of her 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, feeling the warmth of her skin mixed with the coldness of the fear that invaded her. The hospital room had that mixed smell of medicine and disinfectant, and the sound of machines monitoring the girl's vital signs was a constant reminder that her life was hanging by a thread. David, the father, was by her side but seemed distant, not because of a lack of love, but because despair made his chest ache in a different way. While Grace drowned her pain in silent tears and whispered prayers, he shut himself off, trying to be strong, but the truth was that neither of them knew how to bear it. Sophie, who had once been a girl full of energy, could now barely open her eyes. Her breathing was weak, and her little body seemed even smaller amid the white hospital sheets. The doctors gave no clear answers, only saying that the situation was delicate, that they had to wait, that they would do everything possible. But Grace wanted more than that. She wanted a guarantee. She wanted someone to look her in the eye and tell her that her daughter was going to live. One night, while David slept in an uncomfortable chair next to the bed, Grace stroked Sophie's fine strands of hair and whispered with a trembling voice, "You're going to get out of here, my love. I promise you." But deep down, she was afraid that it was an empty promise. The doctor looked at Grace with a serious but compassionate expression. He knew there were no easy words for this conversation. "Mrs. Grace, I know this has been very difficult for you," he said, pulling up a chair and sitting down next to her. "Sophie is strong, but her body has been fighting this disease for a long time. She needs more than medicine, something that touches her heart." Grace frowned in confusion. "What else can be done, doctor? I'm already doing everything I can. I'm here all the time, talking to her, telling her stories." But she remains the same, unresponsive. The doctor took a deep breath before answering. "Sometimes when a child spends so much time sick, they begin to withdraw into themselves, as if the world out there no longer had any meaning. We want to try something different, someone who can bring her comfort in addition to medical treatment, a new presence, a different face. Someone who can form a bond of friendship with her, and perhaps somehow rekindle her will to fight." Grace was silent. The idea seemed good, but at the same time she felt a lump in her throat. How could she trust someone else to care for her? How could she accept that perhaps she wasn't enough to save her own daughter? "I don't know." Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. The doctor touched her hand gently. "Think about it, Mrs. Grace. Let's give her the best possible chance." She looked at her daughter lying in bed, so fragile, and felt a wave of guilt for doubting. If there was even the slightest chance of helping her little girl, she had to take it, swallowing her fear and insecurity. Finally, she nodded. "All right, let's try." It was a difficult decision, but Grace knew she would do anything for Sophie. Even if it meant making room for someone else in that little world, she was desperately trying to keep together. David had always been a hard worker. He was never afraid of fatigue and never complained about difficulties. But now, life seemed to be taking too high a toll. He spent his days at work, with eyes burning from sleep deprivation and tired muscles, but his mind never rested. Every second away from Grace and Sophie, the fear grew. What if something happened while he was gone? What if he was spending all his time trying to pay the bills, and in the end lost what really mattered? The receipts piled up on the kitchen table: rent, electricity, water, food, and now the hospital bills. Every test, every procedure, every medication had a price. And now, with the arrival of the nurse to care for their daughter, the cost would be even higher. Grace saw her husband's suffering. She saw the deep circles under his eyes, his tense shoulders, the way he sighed before leaving the house, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. "Honey, you can't go on like this. You don't sleep well, you hardly eat. This isn't going to end well." David closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before answering. "I have no choice, Grace. How do you think we're paying for all this? The hospital? No, wait. If I don't work, they won't continue treating our daughter." She knew he was right, and at the same time she knew that this effort was taking its toll. David was present, but it was as if he were slowly drifting away, becoming someone she didn't recognize. "I just wish you were here with us more." He rubbed his face, tired and frustrated. "Me too, Grace. But who's going to pay for all this?" She didn't answer, just lowered her head, feeling guilty for wanting something that she knew deep down was impossible. That night, as David left for another extra shift, Grace stayed by her daughter's side, holding her fragile little hand. "Daddy is working hard for you, my love. He wishes he could be here." Sophie didn't answer. She just slept, her long eyelashes resting on her pale skin. Grace felt the tears well up. The family was falling apart, and she didn't know if she would have the strength to keep it together. The next day, Grace felt the firm touch of David's hands on hers. He was tired, that was obvious. The deep circles under his eyes, the unshaven beard, the way he blinked slowly as if fighting sleep. But even so, his eyes had a strength she couldn't ignore. "Love, I told you. I'll take care of the money. I'll work more. I'll borrow if I have to, but you have to take care of our daughter," he said, his voice firm but trembling inside. Grace swallowed hard, feeling the weight of that responsibility. "David, I don't know if I can do it." He squeezed her hands tighter, as if he wanted to pass on his own strength to her. "You can. You always have." She wanted to believe him, but when she looked at Sophie lying in the hospital bed, so small and fragile, she felt fear take hold of her. What if I fail?" David let out a long sigh. His gaze wandered for a moment, as if he too was burdened with the same doubt. "We can't think like that, Grace. If we fall now, who will hold our daughter?" She felt tears burning in her eyes. She wanted to say that she understood, that she agreed, but her voice wouldn't come out. David pulled her into a tight embrace, the kind that seemed to want to put all the broken pieces between them back together. "Everything will be all right," he whispered, although even he didn't seem completely convinced. Grace closed her eyes and wished with all her might that those words were true. Grace spent her nights awake, sitting next to Sophie's bed, holding her cold little hand. The hospital never slept. Machines beeped, nurses came and went through the hallways. But to her, everything seemed like a distant blur. The only thing that mattered was her daughter, lying there so fragile, so silent. She wanted to believe she was doing the right thing, that being strong for Sophie was the most important thing. But deep down, she felt that something was slipping through her fingers. David came home late, left early, and when he was there, it was as if he wasn't there. His gaze was always distant, his voice tired. He hardly spoke to her anymore, hardly looked her in the eye. One night, when he finally came home from work, Grace made coffee and waited for him in the kitchen. He left his keys on the table, loosened his tie, and sighed. "You're still awake?" he asked without surprise. Voice. "We need to talk, David." He ran his hand over his face, visibly exhausted. "Grace, not now. I'm dead tired." She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I know you're tired, but we're losing each other. You hardly talk to me. You hardly see Sophie." David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his irritation. "I'm doing all this for you. I don't enjoy working so much that my whole body hurts." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "I know, David, and I really appreciate it. But money doesn't hold Sophie's hand. When she cries at night, money doesn't tell her stories. She misses you. I miss you." He lowered his head, his shoulders heavy as if he were carrying too great a burden. "I miss you both too, but I don't know what to do, Grace. If I stop working, we'll lose everything." She reached out and touched his face, feeling his unshaven beard, the skin. "Just don't. Don't forget we're still a family, David. Don't let fear separate us." He held her hand for a moment, but then let go, looking away. "I need to get some sleep. I have another shift in a little while." And so he left the kitchen, leaving Grace alone, feeling that with each passing day, David was drifting further away. The hospital was already part of Grace's routine, but that day, something felt different. A woman entered the room with calm steps and a serene look. She wasn't wearing a white coat like the doctors, nor did she have the rigid posture of the nurses Grace saw every day. She brought something else, an air of peace amid the chaos. "Good morning, Mrs. Grace," she said with a gentle smile. "My name is Vera." Grace got up from her chair, observing the stranger. She didn't look like a traditional nurse. Her hair was pulled back haphazardly, and her uniform had seen better days. But there was something in her eyes, something Grace couldn't explain. "Are you the new nurse?" "Yes, I was told that Sophie needs more than just medicine. She needs someone who sees her beyond her illness." Grace crossed her arms suspiciously. And why you? Vera took a deep breath and looked at Sophie, who was sleeping soundly. Because I've been in your place. Grace felt a lump in her throat. What do you mean? My mother was sick for many, many years, and I was by her side until the very last second. I know what it's like to hold the hand of someone you love and not know if that person will still be here tomorrow. I know how much it hurts. For a moment, Grace felt the urge to push her away. She didn't want to hear about loss. She didn't want to think about the possibility of losing her daughter. But at the same time, there was something about this woman that gave her confidence. Vera approached the bed and gently touched Sophie's forehead. Hello, Princess. I'm Vera. I'm going to be here with you, okay? The girl didn't respond or even move. Grace sighed, feeling the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. I just want my daughter to have a chance. Vera looked her in the eyes with a firmness that Grace hadn't expected. Then let's fight this together. At that moment, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope. Sophie looked like a fragile little bird lying in that white bed, surrounded by wires and machines that made constant noises. The days passed, and she remained the same, her little eyes closed, her skin pale, her body motionless. Grace tried to remain hopeful, but deep down, her fear grew. With each passing day, without a reaction, without a glance, without a small smile, she felt her daughter slipping further and further away. But Vera didn't give up. Every morning she entered the room with the same calm smile on her face, sat down at the bed, took Sophie's little hand, and began to talk. You know, Princess, when I was a little girl, my mom used to tell me a story about a magical garden. It was hidden in the middle of the forest, and only people with pure hearts could find it. And then she would tell her the story in a soft, calm voice, as if Sophie could hear her. And maybe she could. Maybe somewhere inside her, those words were reaching her. Sometimes Vera would sing an old song, one of those that lulls the heart and soothes the soul. Sleep, my angel. Dream of the sky. There are stars there, and their light is yours alone. Grace watched from afar. At first she thought it was useless, that none of this would change reality. But as the days passed, she realized that something was different. There was a kind of care that went beyond medicine, beyond treatment, a silent love that asked for nothing in return. One night when Grace entered the room, she found Vera sitting by the bed, holding Sophie's hand, her eyes closed as if she were praying. Do you think she feels it? Grace asked, her voice almost a whisper. Vera opened her eyes and smiled slightly. Love always finds a way, Mrs. Grace, even when we think it won't. And then, with all the care in the world, Vera continued to hold that little hand, as if she were holding the hope of everyone. There, the days and nights blended together, always with the same routine, always with the same anguish. Grace felt the weight of everything on her shoulders. Sophie remained motionless, with no improvement day after day. It seemed to tear a piece of hope from her. But what hurt the most was feeling that David was drifting away. As the days passed, the loneliness grew inside her. One night, while changing Sophie's pillowcase, she heard the bedroom door open. David entered slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep. You're still awake? He asked, closing the door behind him. Of course, David. I never sleep. He sighed, rubbing his face. I didn't come here to argue, and I don't want to argue, Grace replied in a low voice, but full of pain. But do you think this has been easy for me? You hardly look at me. You hardly look at Sophie. It seems like we're going through these ups and downs. David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the rage growing inside him. Don't say that, Grace. You know it's not true. It's not. Then tell me, when was the last time you sat here and held our daughter's hand? When was the last time you talked to me without having one foot at work? His stomach churned, not because she was wrong, but because he knew it was true. But he also felt anger at himself, at the situation. Unable to contain himself any longer, he exploded. Do you think I like being away? Do you think I want to be working while my daughter is here, not reacting to anything? Grace pressed her lips together, her eyes filled with tears. Then why? It seems like you've given up on her. David slammed his hand against the wall, turning his face away so she wouldn't see his tears. I haven't given up, but someone has to pay for all this, Grace. What if I... Stop. Who's going to do it? You! She remained silent. His words were harsh, but they were also true. David took a deep breath, trying to calm his voice. It's only until she gets out of the hospital. Then I'll make up for everything. Grace let out a weak, sad laugh. What if she doesn't get out? David, have you thought about that? He didn't answer. He just ran his hands over his face and left the room without looking back. Grace stood there alone, feeling that little by little, the illness was not only taking Sophie, but the whole family. Grace stood there in the middle of the room, staring at the door through which David had just left. Her chest felt tight, her eyes filled with tears that she insisted on holding back. The silence of the hospital seemed even heavier now. She wanted to hate him for yelling, for throwing such cruel truths in her face. But how could she? He was right. He was doing what he had to do. She sat down next to Sophie's bed and took her small, cold hand. Her skin was fragile, her little fingers so thin. Grace ran her thumb slowly over them, as she used to do when Sophie was a baby, and slept in her arms. Your mommy is here, sweetheart. She always wanted to be strong, to be that mom who says everything will be okay, who holds on without crying. But at that moment, she couldn't. A tear fell silently, and then another, and another. She didn't want David to bear that burden alone, but she didn't want to be alone in this either. She wanted him to be there. She wanted to feel that they were still a family, that they were still together. But each of them was struggling in their own way, and that was pulling them apart. She ran her hand through Sophie's hair and took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. Your daddy loves you very much, you know. He's just tired. He's scared, too. Sophie remained motionless, showing no sign that she could hear, but Grace kept talking as if somehow her daughter could feel her. I promise I'll do everything I can to make us okay, but you need to help me, sweetie. Come back to us. Come back to me. She closed her eyes tightly, holding her daughter's hand even tighter. She cried softly, without sobbing, without making a sound. She cried like someone who has nowhere left to run, like someone who just wants life to go back to the way it was before. Vera never treated Sophie like a patient from the first day. She saw her as a child who could still feel, dream, and live. While the doctors came and went, talking about tests and numbers, Vera stayed. She stayed, holding her hand, telling stories, waiting for a sign that somewhere inside that fragile body, Sophie was still there. At first, Grace watched from afar. She didn't want to get attached to that woman, but little by little she began to realize that Vera had something that no one else there had him: patience. While the doctors treated Sophie's body, Vera cared for her soul. Every morning she would enter the room with a smile and a new idea. Today, we're going to the sea, Vera would say, adjusting the girl's pillow. The sun is shining, and I swear I can feel the breeze from here. And then she would begin to tell stories of waves, colorful seashells, and mermaids singing softly. Another day she arrived with a handful of flowers and scattered them around the room. Flowers have life, you know. They like affection. They like to be talked to, just like you, my princess. She talked and waited. She was never in a hurry. She held Sophie's hand even when there was no response. She read to her, even when the girl's eyes remained closed. Grace began to notice something strange. For the first time in a long time, the hospital room didn't feel so cold. There was a sweet scent in the air, a little more color in the details. One night, as Vera was arranging Sophie's blanket, Grace approached. Why are you doing all this? Vera smiled without taking her eyes off the girl. Because one day, I learned that love also heals. Grace felt her chest tighten. For a second, she closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. She asked God to see all that love. She asked Sophie to feel it. She asked for a miracle more than ever before. Time seemed to be running against her. Sophie was still there, breathing slowly, her chest rising and falling with effort. But now, the doctors were more serious, their gazes lower, their words harsher. That morning, Grace and David were called to speak with the doctor in charge of their daughter's case. He took a deep breath before speaking, as if he too felt the weight of what he had to say. We have done everything we can, but Sophie's condition is very delicate. If there is any worsening, Grace raised her hand, interrupting him. That's what the doctor is trying to say. Continue. But his voice grew stronger. You don't understand. She's getting better. She feels it when we hold her hand. Listen to Vera's stories. She's going to pull through." David closed his eyes, his heart tightening. "No, David." Grace's voice trembled. "They've been saying that from the beginning, and she's still here. She's going to stay here." The doctor looked down for a moment before responding. "I understand how you feel, but we have to be prepared for all possibilities." Grace stood up, dragging the chair hard against the floor. "The only possibility I accept is that my daughter comes home." She left the room with quick steps, her chest burning, tears about to fall. When she entered the room, Vera was sitting there next to Sophie, holding her little hand as always. Grace took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "They think she won't make it." Vera continued to look at Sophie without letting go of her fragile little hand. "And you, what do you think?" Mrs. Grace closed her eyes, letting the tears flow silently. "I think my daughter is going to live." Vera gently squeezed Sophie's hand and smiled. "Then we will believe that, until the end." Later, in the silent hospital chapel, lit only by the dim light of candles, Grace sat there in the last pew with her hands clasped and her eyes closed. But the tears kept falling, her heart tight, her breathing heavy, a pain she didn't know how to bear. She wanted to pray. She wanted to ask for a miracle, but she couldn't, because deep down, she was afraid. Afraid that no one would hear her, afraid that nothing would change. The soft sound of footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Grace didn't even need to look to know who it was. Vera sat down next to her in silence, waited, and when she saw that Grace wasn't speaking, she gathered her courage. "I know it hurts." Grace let out a soft laugh, softly, without humor, without joy. "You have no idea." Vera looked at the cross in front of the altar and took a deep breath. "I know more than you imagine." Grace slowly turned her face. For the first time, she noticed that there was also pain in Vera's eyes. Not the pain of someone who only feels pity, but the pain of someone who has already lived through it. The tears fell even harder, and her voice came out broken, almost a whisper. "What do I do if she leaves?" Vera held her hands firmly, with a tenderness that seemed to tell her she was not alone. "Then we love her with everything we have, as long as she is here." Grace closed her eyes tightly, wanting to push that thought away, but Vera continued. "We don't know what will happen tomorrow, but we know that today, right now, Sophie is here. She feels your touch. She hears your voice. She feels your love, Grace. That's what matters." Grace sobbed softly, letting out all the pain. "I don't know if I can." Vera smiled gently, wiping her tears away carefully. "Yes, you can, because you're a mother, and a mother never gives up." Grace took a deep breath, trying to find strength within herself. Deep down, she knew Vera was right. She couldn't control tomorrow, but she still had today, and as long as Sophie was there, she would give her all the love she could. The night was quiet in the hospital. Grace stayed by Sophie's bedside, as she did every day, but this time, something felt different. The weight on her chest wasn't just from the fear of losing her daughter. It was also because of David. He had been distant for weeks, always working, always tired, always running away from his feelings. But that night, when he entered the room, something in him seemed to have changed. He paused at the door, remained silent for a few seconds, and then walked slowly toward Grace. "How is she?" Grace looked at her daughter, who was sleeping peacefully, and sighed. "The doctors say we have to wait. Always wait." David ran his hand over his face. "What if I try to organize my thoughts? I feel like I'm losing them, both of them." Grace turned to look at him, surprised. "You're hardly here, David. How do you think I feel?" He lowered his head, his eyes full of guilt, if he were trying to gather his thoughts. "I feel like I'm losing both of you." Grace turned to look at him, surprised. "You hardly ever come. David, how do you think I feel?" He lowered his head, his eyes full of guilt. I know I'm wrong, but I didn't know how to deal with all this. Working was the only way I felt useful." Grace was silent. She understood, but that didn't make the pain go away. "I don't know how to deal with this either," she whispered. "I just know that I'm here every day, holding her little hand, talking to her, hoping that someday she'll come back to us." David pulled up a chair and sat down next to her. They stayed like that for a while, saying nothing, just watching Sophie breath. Do you think she feels it?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled, even though her eyes were filled with tears. Vera says that love always comes. I want to believe that. He took Grace's hand and intertwined his fingers with hers. I'm here. I know it took me a while, but I'm here. She squeezed his hand, feeling for the first time in a long time that despite the pain, they were still a family. The soft morning light streamed through the hospital window, illuminating Sophie's face. Grace was at the bedside as always, holding her daughter's little hand and stroking her fine hair. The days had been long, heavy, full of uncertainty, but there she was, steadfast, waiting, believing even when all seemed lost. Vera entered the room slowly, carrying a vase of fresh flowers. She smiled at Grace and sat down on the other side of the bed, taking Sophie's other little hand. It's a beautiful day today, isn't it, Princess? Vera said softly. The sun is shining, just for you. Grace smiled wearily but gratefully that Vera never gave up. If only she could see the silence filling the room. Grace sighed and lowered her head, trying to hold back the tears that fell every day. And then, something happened. A small movement, a slight sigh. Grace raised her head immediately. Vera opened her eyes wide. Sophie's eyelashes trembled slightly, and slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, she opened her eyes. Grace was paralyzed, her heart beating fast. Sophie, the little girl, blinked slowly, her little eyes closed for so long, now shining, albeit tiredly, and then with the greatest sweetness, she smiled. Grace brought her hands to her face, feeling as if the crying was breaking her completely. Vera, at her side, did the same. My God, my love, you're back, sobbed Grace, taking her daughter's face in both hands. Sophie looked at her, her lips trembling with weakness, but her voice came out softly, breaking the silence in the room. Good morning, Mommy. Grace collapsed with emotion, hugging her daughter with all the delicacy in the world. Vera cried beside her, unable to contain her happiness. It was like a breath of life in the midst of despair, like a miracle. But Sophie was very weak. She only opened her eyes for a moment, and then fell back asleep. She didn't even have the strength to speak. Even so, it was a relatively joyful day because of her small reaction. The hospital chapel was small and quiet. The candles gave off a dim light on the wooden benches, and the smell of melted wax mingled with the heavy night air. Grace was kneeling with her hands clasped, her forehead resting on her fingers. She wasn't praying. She couldn't. She just cried, silently, feeling the weight of grief crushing her chest. Vera entered slowly, without making a sound, but Grace sensed her presence. She didn't look up or move. She just let the tears fall one after another, uncontrollably. What do I do if she leaves? Her voice came out weak and broken. Vera knelt beside her and took her hands. Grace's hands were cold and trembling slightly. Then, we love her with everything we have while she is here. Grace closed her eyes tightly, as if those words were a knife piercing her heart. But what will be left of me afterwards? Vera squeezed her hands tighter, her eyes glistening with tears she was also trying to hold back. Love remains, Grace. Every hug remains, every story told, every glance shared. The certainty remains that she knew until the very last second how much she was loved. Grace let out a small sob and hid her face in her hands. I'm so scared. Vera took a deep breath, letting a tear fall down her cheek. Me too, but love has to be bigger than fear. They stayed there kneeling, holding, crying together. There were no promises of miracles, no easy answers. But in that moment, Vera made Grace understand that no matter what happened, Sophie would never be alone, and in some way, neither would she. The hospital room was still filled with emotion. Grace couldn't stop looking at Sophie, who now, after so long, was finally there, awake, conscious, looking at her. David held his daughter carefully, running his fingers through her fine hair as if, make sure it was real. My love, you're back with us, he whispered, his voice trembling. Sophie smiled weakly. I dreamed about you, she said softly, her little eyes blinking slowly. But now it's not a dream, is it? Grace laughed through her tears, kissing her daughter's forehead. No, my princess. Now it's real. Vera stood to one side, watching everything with eyes full of tears. But even in the midst of the joy, She felt a lump in her throat. Something wasn't right. She's very pale, Vera murmured worriedly. Grace frowned. What's wrong? Before Vera could answer, Sophie began to breathe too quickly. Small sighs that soon turned into heavy gasps. The smile disappeared from her little face. Her eyes opened wide with fear, and then a faint sound came out of her mouth, as if she were trying to call her mother. Daughter? Grace asked, feeling panic rising. What's wrong, sweetheart? But Sophie couldn't answer. Her chest rose and fell in a frightening way. Her face turned even paler, and her lips began to lose color. Vera, what's happening? David asked, his voice trembling. Vera was already on her feet, pressing the emergency button on the wall. She can't breathe. Call the doctors now. Grace held her daughter in her arms, her voice broken with despair. Breathe, sweetheart. Look at me. Stay with me, daughter. But Sophie's little eyes began to close. The room filled with voices and hurried footsteps. Doctors and nurses rushed in. One of them tapped Grace's shoulder urgently. We need to take her to intensive care now. Grace didn't want to let go of her daughter. She didn't want to let her go, but firm hands pulled her away. And then the stretcher was pushed out of the room. Mommy is here, she shouted, running after her with her heart broken into pieces. I'm here, my love. But Sophie could no longer respond. The hospital felt even colder. The hallways were long and white, filled with people rushing by. But for Grace and David, time stood still. Sophie was in intensive care. Grace didn't know how many hours had passed. All she knew was that with every second she sat there waiting for an answer, her fear grew more and more. She stared at the closed door, waiting for someone to come out and say that everything was going to be okay, but no one did. Time passed slowly, bringing only the sound of distant footsteps and the beeping of machines inside. David was by her side, sitting in the hard chair with his elbows resting on his knees and his head down. He didn't talk much at first. She felt angry. How could he be so quiet while her world was falling apart? But then, when she looked at him closely, she saw what he was trying to hide. Red eyes, trembling hands, heavy shoulders. He was also broken, but he didn't know how to show it. She ran her hands over her face, trying to hold back the tears once more. But this time, she couldn't. A sob escaped her, and before she could stop it, the tears came pouring out. David raised his head, and for a moment just looked at her, then slowly reached out and took her hand. Grace looked at him in surprise. You're going to get through this, Grace. Her voice came out weak, hoarse, full of fear. She squeezed his hand tightly, letting the tears fall without fear this time. I don't know what to believe anymore, David. I just want to hear your voice again. He moved his chair closer, and for the first time in a long time, the two shared their pain without complaints, without fights, just feeling what they had avoided feeling for so long. His hand held hers firmly, as if that touch held a silent promise. They were there, together, waiting for a miracle. The doctor entered the room with a serious expression, holding a clipboard against his chest. Grace and David stood up at the same time, as if their bodies already knew it wouldn't be good news. We have a new path ahead of us, the doctor began, choosing his words carefully. But we need to talk. Grace felt her hands sweat. David crossed his arms, trying to prepare himself for the worst. Sophie's respiratory crisis has shown that her body is weaker than we thought. We did some new tests, and he paused briefly before continuing. A surgical procedure may be necessary. Grace brought a hand to her mouth. David closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to process the information. And without that surgery, he asked in a low voice, almost fearing the answer. The doctor took a deep breath. The truth is, without it, Sophie might not make it. The silence was crushing. Grace looked at David, waiting for a reaction, but he remained still, staring at a random spot on the wall. And if it still doesn't work? David finally spoke, his voice breaking. And if we do all this? If we put her in the operating room? If we wait for hours and in the end nothing changes? The doctor didn't respond immediately. I'd like to give you a guarantee, but I can't. What I can say is that this could be her best chance. First, we'll wait for her to recover a little, and then we'll proceed with the surgery. David ran his hands over his face, breathing deeply, trying not to break down there in front of everyone. I worked like crazy. I did everything I could, and in the end, none of it worked. He muttered more to himself than to the others. Grace saw her husband sink in the same way she had sunk so many times in recent months. So without saying anything, she took his hand. David looked at her, and in that look, Grace responded without the need for words. There was no choice. There was no other way. She squeezed his hand tightly. So we tried until the last second. We tried. He swallowed hard, and after a long sigh, he just nodded. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he knew that for Sophie, they would do anything. The day had not yet fully dawned when Grace arrived at the hospital. The hallway was silent. The cold lights illuminated the white walls. The smell of disinfectant was the same as always. But that day, something felt different. Her heart raced for no apparent reason, as if her body knew before her mind that something was wrong. When she approached Sophie's room, she realized that the door was ajar. She took a step forward, ready to enter, but stopped at that very moment. Vera was sitting there next to the bed, holding Sophie's little hand tightly. But what made Grace freeze was something else. Vera was crying. They weren't normal tears, the kind that fall discreetly and are quickly wiped away. They were heavy tears that ran down her face uncontrollably. "I wish you didn't have to go through this, my little one." Vera's voice was a trembling whisper. Grace held her breath, trying to understand what was happening. Vera had always been strong, always had a smile, always knew what to say. But now, there in front of Sophie, she seemed broken. "I would give anything to see you running around there, playing, laughing, living," Vera continued, squeezing the little girl's hand even tighter. "You deserve so much more than this bed, these tubes, this pain." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears, but she didn't move. Vera ran her hand over Sophie's face, as if she wanted to save that moment, as if she were afraid it would be the last. "I promise I'll be with you until the end, no matter what happens. I'm not going to leave." Grace couldn't take it anymore. She laughed softly, her eyes already filled with tears. Vera was startled and tried to wipe her face quickly, but Grace saw everything. "Vera, what's going on?" The nurse forced a weak smile, but her eyes were full of pain. "Nothing, Mrs. Grace. Just a difficult day." Grace didn't believe her. For the first time, she realized that there was something about Vera that no one had noticed before. A weight on her shoulders, a look that hid more than she showed. Without saying anything else, she approached and sat down next to the nurse. She took her hand, and they sat there in silence, each holding one of Sophie's hands. Neither knew what the future held for them, but at that moment, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Grace couldn't get the image of Vera crying next to Sophie out of her head. Something was wrong, something Vera was hiding. The days in the hospital were always the same, but now, Grace noticed more. She noticed that Vera sometimes took a deep breath before getting up, as if she needed strength to continue, that her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted Sophie's sheets, that her smile, although sincere, hid something behind it. That afternoon, while David went out to get coffee, Grace walked down the hall and stopped at the door to the staff room. It was open. Inside, Vera was sitting with her back to the entrance, holding a small bottle of medicine. Grace stood there watching. What caught her attention most was the way Vera held that bottle, as if it were something valuable and necessary. Then, before she could think, she entered the room. "What's that, Vera?" She jumped and tried to hide the bottle, but it was too late. Grace approached and took the bottle from her hands. She read the label, and her heart raced. "This is..." Vera lowered her head. "It's strong medicine." "I know." Grace looked at her, confused. "Are you sick?" Vera's silence was her answer. Grace felt a chill in her stomach. "Tell me it's nothing serious, please." Vera forced a weak smile. "I wish I could say that." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "How long have you known?" "A few months before I started working here." Grace put her hand to her mouth, feeling her chest tighten. "Why didn't you say anything?" Vera took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Because I needed to be here. I wanted to be here. Sophie needed someone, and I needed her." Grace felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Vera, the woman who had always been by her side, who had held her hand in the most difficult moments, who had given her strength when all seemed lost, was dying. "This isn't fair," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. Vera smiled, taking her hand. Life has never been fair, but what matters is what we do with the time we have. Grace closed her eyes tightly, feeling her heart tighten. How could someone so full of life be leaving? How could fate be so cruel? Grace was still holding the medicine bottle in her hands, but she no longer had the strength to close them. Her chest felt tight, as if there wasn't enough air to breathe. Vera, the woman who had been a pillar of strength for her and for Sophie, was seriously ill. You have to take care of yourself. You have to stop working. You have to rest. Grace's voice came out shaky, full of despair. Vera smiled with that same calm smile as always, as if nothing had changed. That doesn't matter now. Grace felt a lump in her throat. How does it not matter? You're sick, Vera, and so is Sophie. Grace blinked several times, trying to understand. But you need help too. Vera took a deep breath and took the bottle from her hands. I know, but right now what matters is Sophie. She needs us. Grace ran her hands over her face, feeling the hot tears running down her cheeks. Are you telling me you're willing to forget about yourself for my daughter? Vera looked down. For a moment, when she looked back at Grace, her eyes were firm. But there was something there, a hidden fear, a weariness she was trying to hide. I'm not forgetting about myself. I'm just prioritizing what's important. Grace swallowed hard. Vera was strong, but in her eyes, Grace could see what she was trying to hide. She was afraid of what would come next, afraid of the time she had left. Grace squeezed her hand tightly, letting the tears fall uncontrollably. I don't want to lose you too. Vera squeezed her hand back but said nothing, only smiled a smile full of things Grace couldn't understand, and that hurt even more. David had always been grateful to her. Since she arrived, things had changed, and Grace was no longer so alone in the fight for Sophie, but he had never really stopped to look at Vera. He was always too busy, too tired, too worried. That night, while waiting for visiting hours in the ICU, he saw her from afar. She was sitting in the hallway with her elbows resting on her knees and her eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time, she didn't look like that strong, unbreakable woman. She just looked tired. He approached slowly and sat down beside her. Are you okay? Vera smiled slightly without looking at him. Difficult question. David took a deep breath. Grace told me about you, about your illness. Vera closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather the strength to respond. So now they know. He looked ahead, lost in his thoughts. I don't know what to say. She finally turned to look at him, and her smile was the same as always, calm and understanding. You don't have to say anything. He remained silent for a while until she lowered her head and let out a long sigh. I spent so much time worrying about money, about bills, about work. And meanwhile, you were here taking care of my daughter, my wife, even taking care of me, without me realizing it. Vera let out a soft laugh. You did what you thought you had to do. Everyone deals with pain in their own way. David looked at her truly for the first time. She wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just someone who took care of Sophie. She had become part of them. He reached out and took her hand the same way he did with Grace when she cried. You're part of our family, Vera. She smiled from the heart, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for letting me be part of it. They stood there in silence, two tired people full of invisible scars, but now understanding that they were united by something greater. It wasn't just pain, it was love. The ICU room was silent, only the sound of the monitors filling the space. Grace slept in a chair next to the bed, her head resting on her arms. David was on the other side with his eyes closed, but not really sleeping. Exhaustion had taken hold of them both, but fear still kept them alert. Then a soft sound broke the silence. Mom. Grace opened her eyes immediately. David also woke up, startled. Sophie, the little girl, was slowly, still very weak, but awake. Her little eyes, previously dull, now shone slightly. Grace threw herself on top of her, holding her little face with trembling hands. My love, my God, you're back. David took his daughter's little hand, his heart racing. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Sophie smiled softly, eager to see someone. Tears ran down Grace's face. Who, my love? Mommy? Daddy? The girl took a deep breath and looked around as if searching for someone. Vera. Grace and David looked at each other. Vera was there, but a little way off, sitting on the sofa, watching everything with eyes full of emotion, but her face was paler than usual, and her slumped shoulders showed her exhaustion. Sophie smiled at her, still finding it difficult to speak. "Will you tell me a story like before?" Vera took a deep breath, as if trying to gather her strength. "I thought you weren't going to ask me." Grace moved over a little to make room for her, and Vera slowly approached, sitting down next to the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she took Sophie's little hand. "Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a very brave girl." Vera's voice was low, but full of affection. She fought against storms, faced dark days, and never gave up. Sophie slowly closed her eyes, but a peaceful smile appeared on her little face. Grace and David just watched, feeling something in their hearts that they couldn't explain. That scene, that moment, was love in its purest form. Dawn brought a fragile hope. Sophie was awake. She had smiled. She had asked for a story, but the doctors soon broke the news that would break everyone's hearts. Grace, David, and Vera were in the ICU hallway when the doctor approached. His expression was serious but not cold. He understood the weight of those words before he even said them. "We need to operate now that she's stable enough." Grace felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "But she just woke up. She's improving." "No," the doctor sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Improving, yes, but she's still very fragile. If we don't operate, her body might not withstand another crisis." David closed his eyes for a moment, running his hands over his face. If the surgery doesn't go well." The doctor didn't respond immediately. "There are risks, but without the surgery, there are no chances." Grace looked at Vera as if searching for the answer her heart couldn't find. But for the first time, even Vera had no words. She just took her hand and squeezed it tightly. David took a deep breath, fighting back tears. "Then we'll do it." Grace closed her eyes, feeling an immense weight on her chest. That night, she sat next to her daughter and ran her fingers through her hair, her heart aching. "Tomorrow the doctors take care of you, my love." Sophie blinked slowly, tired again, just like last time. Grace forced a smile, trying to hide her fear. "Yes, just like last time, and when you wake up, Mommy will be here, and Daddy too." The girl smiled softly, and Vera approached and took her little hand. "I've never left your side, Princess." Sophie closed her eyes, trusting blindly in those words. Grace looked at Vera and felt a lump in her throat. She knew that Vera was fighting something that no one could see, and that despite that, she was there for Sophie. The surgery would be in a few hours. All they could do now was wait. The hospital waiting room felt suffocating. The clock on the wall marked each minute cruelly slowly. Time had never passed so slowly. Sophie was about to be taken to surgery, but before that, Grace, David, and Vera stayed by her side, holding her small, warm hands. The girl looked at each of them with a calm, innocent smile, as if she didn't know the gravity of the moment. "I'm going to sleep again, right?" Sophie asked, blinking slowly. Grace smiled, running her hand over her face. "Yes, sweetheart, but when you wake up, we'll be here as always, and you'll go home." Sophie looked at David. "You promise, Daddy." David pressed his lips together, holding back tears. "I promise, sweetheart. I would never leave here without you." The girl turned her gaze to Vera. "And you, Vera?" The nurse smiled, holding her little hand affectionately. "I'm not good at making promises, but this time, I promise. Tomorrow, the four of us will meet here." "Deal." Sophie smiled a weak but confident smile. "Deal." She squeezed the hands of the three of them at the same time, small and fragile, but full of love. The doctors entered the room. "It's time, Grace." A chill ran through her body. David swallowed hard. Vera said nothing, just held the girl's hand until the last second. The stretcher was wheeled away, and the three of them stood there watching as their daughter disappeared down the hallway. In the waiting room, time stood still. Grace couldn't sit still. She paced back and forth, her hands trembling. David, always the stronger one, was silent, staring at the floor. The hours and minutes felt like a blow to the chest. In a moment of exhaustion and despair, Grace sat down next to David without thinking. He took her hand. "She'll come back with us, right?" His voice came out almost in a whisper. Grace didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say yes, that everything would be fine, that it was just another scare. But the truth was that she was also afraid. David closed his eyes and, for the first time, let a tear escape. Grace, without thinking twice, hugged him tightly. He didn't resist, just hid his face in her shoulder and cried silently. Too weak to pretend to be strong, Vera watched from afar with teary eyes, feeling a weight grow in her chest. What no one said, but everyone felt, was that the weight seemed like an eternity, and the fear of what would come next was unbearable. The waiting room was plunged into silence. Only the sound of the clock on the wall and the discreet rustling of the nurses' clothes as they hurried down the hallway broke the stillness of the room. Grace and David sat side by side, their hands clasped in a silent gesture of support. But a little further away, she kept her eyes fixed on the operating room door, as if expecting Sophie to come out at any moment with a smile on her face. But suddenly, something changed. Vera felt a lump in her throat and a sudden dizziness that made her vision darken. For a moment, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to hide it. Not now, not at that moment. She discreetly ran her hand over her forehead and felt her skin cold and sticky, with icy sweat running down the back of her neck. Her body was crying out for help, but she couldn't allow herself to break down. Grace noticed when Vera became too still. "Vera, are you okay?" The nurse opened her eyes and forced a smile, just a little tired. David looked at her suspiciously. "You look very pale." Vera tried to settle into her chair, but a chill ran down her spine, and her hands began to shake slightly. She clenched her fists, trying to hide it. "I'm fine, it's just nerves." Grace didn't believe her. She got up and approached her, touching her forehead. "Vera, you're freezing," Vera said before she could finish her sentence. Vera felt the floor disappear beneath her. The room spun around her and a loud buzzing filled her ears. Her knees buckled and she fell forward. Vera screamed. Grace caught her before she hit the floor. David ran to help, but Vera tried to get up immediately, grabbing the chair. "I'm fine." Grace held her firmly by the shoulders, saying that. "You look terrible." A nurse passing by in the hallway noticed the situation and approached. "What happened?" Vera waved her hand weakly. "Nothing, just a little dizzy." The nurse looked at Grace and David, waiting for a more honest answer. "You need to be checked out," Grace said, her eyes shining with concern, but Vera shook her head, breathing heavily. "No, I can't." David frowned. "Vera, for God's sake, look at yourself." "Vera." She grabbed Grace's sleeve and squeezed it with what little strength she had left. I promised Sophie I'd be here when she woke up." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "But how are you going to be here if you can't even stand up?" Vera's eyes began to fill with tears. She knew Grace was right, but admitting it meant accepting something she had been denying for a long time. Her body was failing. The nurse, she crouched down beside her, taking her pulse to check her heartbeat. "You need attention now. Look me in the eyes." For a moment she took a deep breath and tried to be strong, but at that moment she realized that her strength was no longer enough. The clock on the wall ticked cruelly, each second seeming to drag on, making the wait unbearable. Grace stared at it without really seeing the numbers, blurred by the tears she was trying to hold back. David paced back and forth, to and fro, breathing heavily, his fists clenched. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life. He always believed he could solve any problem with hard work, effort, and sacrifice. But now, nothing he did could help his daughter. Vera was sitting on one of the benches in the waiting room, her body weak but her mind alert. She wanted to focus only on Sophie, but her own body seemed to betray her. The dizziness was still there, the cold running through her skin, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Not now. Time passed. First an hour, then 2, then 3. Grace began to despair. "It's taking too long. It's taking too long." David approached, trying to stay calm for her, but his voice failed him. "The doctors know what they're doing." Grace closed her eyes, letting the tears finally flow. "But what if something goes wrong?" He didn't answer, just took her hand and squeezed it tightly. Vera watched them with a heavy heart. There was nothing she could say to ease the moment. A nurse walked down the hall and Grace jumped up. "How is my daughter?" The woman stopped, hesitated. "The surgery isn't over yet, ma'am, but it's been a long time." Grace almost screamed. The nurse just lowered her head. The doctors are doing everything they can. She left, leaving Grace even more distressed. Grace turned to look at Vera with eyes full of despair. Tell me everything is going to be okay. Please tell me everything is going to be okay. Vera swallowed hard, holding back her emotions. I wish I could say that. Grace slumped down on the bench next to her, covering her face with her hands. If something happens to my daughter, I don't know what will become of me. Vera ran her hand through Grace's hair in a gesture of affection. You will continue to love her, no matter what happens. Grace sobbed, squeezing her eyes shut tightly. David sat down next to her and hugged her shoulders. The surgery was still going on, and all they could do was wait and wait. It had never been so painful. The operating room door opened slowly. Grace held her breath, feeling her heart almost stop. David jumped up. Vera tried to lean on the arm of the chair, but her legs were weak. The doctor walked toward them with a tired but unhurried expression. The silence was unbearable. Grace couldn't wait any longer. Doctor, my daughter. The doctor took off his cap, ran his hand over his face, and sighed. The surgery was long. We had some difficult moments. David clenched his fists, feeling the blood freeze in his veins. For God's sake, doctor! The doctor looked them in the eyes and finally smiled. Sophie did very well. She lives up to her name. Grace felt her legs give way, but David caught her before she fell. Sob escaped her throat, and when she realized it, she was already hugging her husband with all her strength. My God, she did it. Our daughter did it. David took Grace's face in his hands. His eyes filled with tears and a trembling smile. She's strong. Our little girl is strong, Grace cried uncontrollably. David, who had carried the weight of the world for so long, let the tears fall too. Vera watched the scene, feeling relief filling her chest. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't just excitement. She felt a chill run through her body, and her hands began to shake. David noticed when she staggered to one side. Vera tried to respond, but everything spun around her. The last thing she heard was Grace shouting her name before everything went dark. Her body gave way, and David managed to catch her in his arms before she hit the ground. The doctor rushed over. Quickly, hold her here. Grace was paralyzed. For a second, Vera, stay with me, please. The nurses came running. She needs attention now. David looked at Grace desperately. My God, what's happening? Grace felt her chest tighten again, as if the happiness of a minute ago had been mercilessly ripped away. Vera, who had always been there for all of them, was now falling, and fear took hold of Grace again. The hospital still smelled of medicine and disinfectant, but for Grace, something had changed. The fear was no longer the same as before. Sophie was alive. Her daughter had survived. Now she was recovering, her cheeks a little rosier and her eyes shining, although she was still weak. But victory came with another struggle. Vera was in a room a few corridors away, lying pale and tired. For the first time, it wasn't her holding someone's hand. Now it was her who needed to be held. Grace and David entered slowly, as if they didn't want to wake her, but Vera opened her eyes as soon as she felt their presence. I'm alive, she joked with a weak smile. Grace didn't laugh. She sat down next to her and took her hand. Yes, but now it's our turn to take care of you. Vera's eyes filled with tears, but she turned her face away, trying not to show her emotion. It's okay. I can take care of myself. David crossed his arms and shook his head. You took care of our daughter, my wife, even me. Now it's our turn. Vera sighed, feigning impatience, but her gaze softened. Grace squeezed her hand affectionately. Now it's our turn to hold your hand for a moment. Vera was silent, then let the tears fall without resistance. She had spent so much time being strong for others, so much time hiding her pain, that she had forgotten what it was like to be cared for. Grace tucked the blanket around her with the same care that Vera had so often shown Sophie. At that moment, Vera realized that for the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone. Time passed slowly in the hospital. Sophie was recovering well, growing a little stronger every day, but something was still missing. Grace realized this when she entered her daughter's room and saw her looking toward the door, as if waiting for someone. She sat down on the bed and ran her fingers through the girl's fine hair. What are you thinking about, my love? Sophie turned slowly with that sweet but nostalgic look. Vera isn't coming. Grace felt a lump in her throat. She knew this moment would come. Vera is also sick, sweetheart. She's resting. Sophie frowned. Like me? Yes, but she's also getting better. The girl was silent for a moment, as if thinking about something very important. Can I see her? Grace smiled, feeling her eyes fill with tears. I think that would make her very happy. Shortly after, Sophie was taken to the room where Vera was. The nurse was asleep, her face pale, her thin arms resting on the blanket. Grace helped her daughter settle into an armchair next to the bed, and Sophie took Vera's hand with her little fingers. Vera, it's me. It took the nurse a few seconds to react, but then she slowly opened her eyes when she saw Sophie there, really smiling at her. Her heart beat fast. My princess. Her voice came out weak and shaky. Sophie squeezed her hand tightly. I've been waiting for you to tell me another story. Vera felt her eyes burn, and tears fell before she could stop them. Grace watched everything, holding back her own emotions. Vera, who so often held back her tears to be strong for others, now let the tears flow without fear. She smiled, her eyes still shining. Then I think I have to make up a very nice one for you. Sophie rested her head on the arm of the chair, without letting go of Vera's hand. It can be about a happy ending. The nurse swallowed and stroked the girl's hair. Yes, my love, it can. The days passed, but Vera did not improve. At first, she pretended to be fine, smiling at Grace and David, and saying it was just tiredness. But the truth was in her eyes, in her slow movements, in the way she clutched the sheet tightly when she thought no one was watching, trying to endure the pain that grew worse every day. Grace realized it when she started avoiding direct eye contact, when she started talking less, when her breathing became shorter. One afternoon, while Vera was resting, Grace entered the room and stood there just watching her. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as if each breath were an effort. Her skin was pale, thin as paper. Grace sat down beside her and took her hand. You're getting worse, aren't you? Vera opened her eyes slowly and tried to smile, but this time she couldn't fake it. I think my body got tired of helping me lie. Grace felt the tears well up. Why didn't you say anything before? Vera took a deep breath. Because I wanted more time with you, with Sophie. Grace squeezed her hand, as if that could keep her there, prevent her from leaving. You're going to have more time. Vera smiled faintly, but her eyes said otherwise. Everyone thinks they have more time, Grace, until they realize they don't. Grace closed her eyes tightly, as if that could keep reality out. Vera brought her hand to Grace's face and lovingly wiped away her tears. Don't cry for me. Grace held that cold hand against her face, letting her tears wet her fingers. How can you expect me not to cry? You're leaving. Vera ran her fingers through Grace's hair as she used to do with Sophie. I'm not leaving. I'm just going first. Grace sobbed, too weak to hold back the pain. Vera took a deep breath and closed her eyes. For a moment, she knew the end was near, and for the first time, she was afraid. The night was silent in the hospital. The sound of the machines, the hurried footsteps of the nurses in the hallways, everything seemed distant. In the room, only Vera's breathing filled the space. Vera filled the space. She lay with her gaze lost on the ceiling, as if she no longer belonged there. Grace and David sat next to her. Since the doctors said there was nothing more they could do, they hadn't moved from her side. Vera moved her fingers slowly over the sheet, trying to gather the strength to speak. You can come closer. Her voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Grace leaned over immediately, taking Vera's hand gently. David did the same, swallowing the lump in his throat. We're here, Vera. Vera smiled slightly, looking at them both as if she wanted to keep that moment forever. You gave me more than I could ever dream of. Grace shook her head, tears already running down her face. Don't talk like that. Vera squeezed her hand slightly, her eyes shining not only with pain, but also with gratitude. I never had anyone who cared about me until I found you. David lowered his head, taking a deep breath to keep from breaking down. She's always been part of our family. But she smiled again, her face tired, her eyes slowly closing. Before they did, she looked at Grace one last time. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. Grace felt her heart break. We love you. Thank you, Vera, for everything." Vera closed her eyes, and a long sigh escaped her lips. The room fell silent. Grace squeezed her hand tightly, as if she could hold on to her for a moment longer. David felt a hot tear run down his face as he looked at the woman who had changed their lives forever. She was leaving, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The sound of the heart monitor, which had been slow and steady, became a single continuous beep. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. David closed his eyes tightly, feeling a hot tear run down his face. Sophie looked around in confusion. Vera Grace knelt beside her daughter, gently holding her shoulders. "My love." The girl looked at the nurse once more and fell asleep. Grace pulled Sophie into a tight hug, unable to say a single word. Vera's time was up, but the love she left behind would never end. The hospital was quieter than ever. It wasn't the normal silence of the early morning or empty waiting rooms. It was a heavy silence, laden with nostalgia, pain, and farewell. The news spread quickly. Nurses, doctors, even employees who did not work directly with Vera stopped for a moment when they heard she was no longer there. Grace walked aimlessly through the hallways, her head spinning, her chest aching, as if something were being torn from inside her. She was not just a nurse. She was not just someone who had been there to help them. Vera had become part of her, part of Sophie, part of David. She felt like she had lost a sister. She reached her daughter's room and found Sophie sitting on the bed, staring at her own hands. "Mom, when is Vera coming back?" Grace felt her legs give way. She sat down next to the girl, pulled her into a hug, and hid her face in her fine hair. "My love." Sophie was silent for a moment. Then in her sweet, innocent voice, she whispered, "She went to live in heaven." Grace couldn't answer. She just hugged her tighter, feeling the tears wet her daughter's hair. David stood outside the room, leaning against the wall, staring at the floor. He had always been a strong man. He had endured everything, but now he felt a void he didn't know how to fill. Vera taught him something he had never stopped to think about. Sacrifice is not just working until you're exhausted. It's not just paying bills or carrying responsibilities. True sacrifice is giving yourself to others. It's being present, and Vera gave herself to them until the very last second. A doctor walked down the hall and looked at David with respect and sadness. David understood. Everyone there felt the loss because Vera wasn't just a nurse. She was love. Vera's room was now just an empty space. The bed was made, the sheets folded. No presence that could fill the silence. Grace entered slowly, her heart tight. Her scent was still there, a light perfume mixed with the aroma of medicine and cotton. She ran her hand over the mattress, remembering all the times she sat next to Vera, holding her hand, begging her to stay a little longer. But now, there was no one left to hold. She took a deep breath and looked around. On the table next to the bed was a small blue notebook. It lay there discreetly, as if waiting to be found. Grace frowned, picked up the notebook carefully, and felt a chill run through her body when she saw the simple handwriting on the first page. For Sophie. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the letters and then turned the page. It was a book of stories, but not just any stories. They were stories written by Vera, short stories about a brave girl who faced challenges, who fought against storms, who never gave up. Grace turned more pages and noticed something even more beautiful. In the middle of the texts were little messages. If you ever feel afraid, close your eyes and remember all the times you have been strong. If sadness comes, look up at the sky. I will be there listening to you. You are light. My little one, never let anything dim your brightness. Tears began to fall silently. She hugged the notebook to her chest and closed her eyes, feeling Vera's presence there, so alive, so present. She hadn't left. Her love remained. The long-awaited day had finally arrived after so many months living among machines, medicines, and uncertainty. Sophie was ready to go home. Grace arranged the last details in her daughter's small suitcase, carefully folding the pajamas that Vera used to lay out every night in the hospital room. That room, which for so long had been a place of fear and hope, now seemed too small to contain everything they had experienced there. David entered the room with a tired but sincere smile. "Ready, champ?" Sophie, sitting on the bed, nodded with a sparkle in her eyes. "Really? We're leaving, Daddy? Seriously?" Grace crouched down in front of her daughter, holding her delicate little face in her hands. "Yes, my love. We're going home." The girl smiled, but soon looked away toward the small table next to the bed. The blue notebook was there. Grace understood immediately. She took the notebook and placed it in her daughter's small hands. "Vera wanted you to take it." Sophie pressed the notebook to her chest. "So she's coming with us, right, Mommy?" Grace felt tears welling up, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. "Always, my love, always." Sophie took her mother's hand and looked at her with shining eyes. "We're going home, Mommy." Grace felt her chest tighten, but she smiled. "Let's go, my princess." She picked up her daughter, and David put his arm around both of them. The hospital was behind them, but the love they had found there would never leave them. The sun shone gently in the sky, and a light breeze blew, carrying the scent of flowers from the garden. Sophie sat on the terrace of her house, swinging her feet in the air, holding the blue notebook to her chest. It was her first day out of the hospital. Grace and David watched her from afar in silence. After so much time living between white walls and beeping machines, it was strange to see her there, looking at the fresh air, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. But it was also beautiful. Sophie slowly opened the notebook and ran her little fingers over the handwritten pages, the simple drawings, the words, full of love. Everything there belonged to Vera. She was silent for a moment, then looked up at the blue sky. "Mom." Grace came over and sat down next to her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sophie pointed upward with a small smile. "See, she's still with us, right?" Grace felt a lump in her throat and also looked up at the sky. The wind moved the leaves on the trees. The sun shone brighter, and somehow she knew for sure. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and hugged her gently. "Yes, sweetheart, she never left." Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind touch her face. "I think he's smiling right now." Grace smiled, and without anyone noticing, wiped away a tear. "I think so too." Grace and David stood still, watching Sophie, who continued to gaze at the sky with the blue notebook pressed against her chest. The wind ruffled the girl's fine hair, and a ray of sunlight illuminated her little face, which now a different kind of peace. She was still small, but she had lived more than many people in a lifetime. She had known pain, struggle, and loss, but she had also known the purest love, the kind that never fades, even when the person is gone. Grace looked at David, and he looked back at her. No words were necessary. They felt the same lump in their throats, the same gratitude, the same certainty. Time passed, but Vera never left. Grace felt her presence in the small gestures of day-to-day life, in the aroma of the coffee she made in the morning, remembering the conversations in the hospital, in the gentle breeze that came in through the window, bringing the feeling of an invisible hug, in Sophie's smile, which sometimes had the same sparkle that Vera had in her eyes. David also noticed it in the moments of silence when he watched his daughter play and wondered how they had managed to get through it all, in Grace's strength, which seemed to have inherited a piece of Vera's courage in her own heart, now understanding better what was really important. Sophie felt it in a pure, innocent way. She held the blue notebook every night before bed, as if it were a treasure, reading Vera's words and smiling, as if the nurse were there telling each story personally. Now I want to know from you, what would you do in Grace's place? Could you be as strong as Vera, even knowing that your time was running out? Tell me in the comments. I would love to hear your opinion, and if this story moved you. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next videos. Now click on the video that appears on the screen. It's a moving story that has already made many people cry and rethink their lives. I'm sure you'll get goosebumps from beginning to end.